Good morning and welcome to this live reaction to Newcastle United's 1-0 victory over AFC Wimbledon in the Carabao Cup last night. Waiting for a few people to join. I'll just put it on Twitter as well. Just give me a second. But if you are in the chat, put some comments in the chat box and like the stream as well to help it grow, help it get to more people to see it. Just tweet now that I'm going live. Bear with me a second. I'm not expecting too many people to join this one because obviously it's not ideal timing to react to a game that not much happened in, and it's the next morning and people are at work and doing various things. So, even if one or two or no people join, I'll just talk to myself and you can watch it back on catch up later. But not the best game, not the best performance, but I think in a game like that, it only really matters. The result is all that really matters. Ultimately, job got done. Newcastle go through to face Chelsea. They'll take that game a little bit more seriously in the sense of where they want to go. I don't think if Newcastle are sat on Wembley Way, the point I'm trying to make is I don't think if Newcastle stood on Wembley Way in the end of February or early March, whatever the date of the Carabao Cup final is, they're not going to be looking back at the game against Wimbledon and thinking, they only scraped through that. No one really cares once the game's done at this stage of the competition. So it's not going to be a big deep dive into the performance because also obviously the team was different as well. But once a few people hopefully join and put some stuff in the chat. If you are in there's a few of you in here now, please drop something in the chat so I can bounce off you guys and we can get going. But yeah, it was always going to be a strange night because I think Eddie Howe's team selection was always going to be interesting to see where he went with it. And ultimately, it was a mixture of strong. Johnny says, "Can we not talk about the match last night? What would you like to talk about instead, Johnny?" On a serious point, either tonight or tomorrow, I'm going to do a live video. I think there's worth doing a live video on because there's lots of talk about. Obviously, Luke Edwards has done a piece on the Telegraph about. Luke Edwards has done a piece in the Telegraph about the moving the stadium, possibly the cost of the stadium, and there's lots of debate about moving again or staying. So I might do a live either tonight or tomorrow. Obviously, I'll make a decision pretty quickly on that. I will do a live certainly, whether it's that tomorrow, I don't know, on the stadium. So join me for that, and we can have a better debate. But yeah, the game last night wasn't great, was it? If you are in the chat, please drop some thoughts if you have anything to say, and then we can go. And also like the stream, as I say. Sai says, we seem to be a bit like Everton under Moyes. We play great against bigger teams and poor against lesser teams. Yeah. As I say, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I'm not so concerned about the performance. It was all about those, and maybe this is what the players were thinking as well, rightly or wrongly. It was just about the result, so they weren't. There wasn't this sort of desire to, and it sounds like I'm questioning the desire, which is way worse than what I mean. But like, it sounds like everyone just collectively wanted to get the game done. The result was more important than the performance. It was a struggle, says Johnny. The fringe players got some fringe players some minutes, win and move on. Played in bubble wrap. Yeah, I think that's the thing. There is a serious point about the quality of the players coming in. I think that does need to be discussed. And in my opinion, it's still interesting that Newcastle still have to play Bruno every time that they win. Like, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody in the chat, but I think that the record still stands that Newcastle have not won a game without Bruno in the team in some sort, either coming off the bench or starting. And Um, Wimbledon came with a low block and they made it difficult, absolutely. But when do you get a bit concerned that you can't break down a team? And because this is a consistent theme about Newcastle breaking down teams, we've spoken so many times on these lives and videos about Newcastle in possession, and Eddie Howe's tried to do this thing of changing the way that they play. But the two things that you need to be very good at in possession are, one, passing the ball particularly well, which is not something that Newcastle do, in my opinion, certainly yet well enough to dictate that style of play. And then the second thing is breaking teams down, and they just don't seem to be very good at that either. And there was a lack of creativity in the first 11 last night, obviously, and I think this comes back to everything ultimately comes back to the recruitment in the summer. I think this is the worrying thing I have going forward is that you can still two of the things that you see this season. I mean, three if you count Asuna not being ready and the fact that Isak and Wilson are still injured. So you've still got a striker issue. We will talk in more detail about Asuna in a few minutes. But the worry that I have is you're still seeing a lack of recovery pace every game in defence, which shows why they wanted a centre back. And now you're seeing a lack of creativity. They really needed a new right winger who had a bit of difference about him to get at the opposition and unlock the opposition. They rely too much on Gordon and Gordon has been not up until the City game not good enough at this season as well. Harvey Barnes is great, but he's not a creative winger. He's a goal scoring winger. He's good at what he does, but what he does isn't creative. He sort of, or he might he's not unpredictable. He's not going to unlock a defense because the way he plays is very regimented. He's just very, very good at it. He scores goals, cutting inside. He crosses well, cutting inside and getting it and running directly out of fullback. But he's not going to get you off your seat in the way that Gordon can and Sir Maximin, for example, did. Almiron's the same. He's very regimented, very structured in what he does. And Murphy's there's too much sameness in the winger department. Just as at the back, there's not enough pace that's been exposed this season. That's my worry, is that every game I see something, especially when Newcastle don't play well, it comes from this idea that they're not good enough at doing what they're trying to do. They've tried to evolve the team and change the way that the team plays without enough changes to the playing staff to bring in people who can do these things. Like the midfield is fine. I think I've checked out my Joe Linton video after the City game. I think that's kind of an evergreen video rather than City analysis, because I think that there's a question mark about Joe Linton's suitability to this new way of playing if they want to go forward, because he isn't very good on the ball. He isn't particularly good at recycling possession. He's good at playing the ball forward when he needs to and linking the play and pressing high, and all the sort of physical aspects of his game are brilliant. And that's why he suited a more transitional game on Saturday. But it was a great example against Wimbledon. But also, it's going to be a bigger example against most teams, because Newcastle the point I'm trying to make is Newcastle are leaning into this, and yet they still seem quite undercooked at it. Like the midfield, I think will be fine because you've got Tonali and Bruno who are very good on the ball, and then you can mix it up with a little bit with Longstaff. Miley could come in once he's fit and back. He can progress the ball quite well. That's one of his strengths. So, in the midfield, I don't really have too many concerns about Newcastle's possession long term, but it's this sort of idea that they want to play a high line and dominate the pitch high up, but they don't have any recovery pace at the back. They want to break teams down in defence, low block defences down. They don't have enough creativity or unpredictability in their forward line, and ultimately that's why I think that they struggle. And then, when Isak isn't there or Wilson isn't there, there's an issue with that as well. Dexter says 3 years ago, half our squad was the second worst team in England. Howe has done an amazing job improving players, but many of these lads need to be at 100% to give 7 out of 10 performances. Si says, do I see Miley being Joe Linton's long-term replacement? Has Howe got the most from the squad? Says Dexter. Yeah, that's some really good points there. I'll first of all I'll tackle Si's question about Miley. I think that there's a possibility. I mean, like I'm gonna maybe make this again. I don't want to say that. I'm so glad that Joe Linton plays for Newcastle United, and I'm so glad that uh, that he's here and he signed that contract and he has become this player. Because I don't think, to Dexter's point about getting the 7 out of 10 out of these players, I think with Almiron, with Longstaff, with I don't know who else, Murphy, those players, Burn maybe to a point. I know he obviously came in, but to those players, I think Dex is absolutely right. Eddie Howe's done wonders to get that. But whereas Joe Linton was underperforming, not quite right, there was something else that other people, there was something else in him. He was, you know, there was a reason Newcastle bought him for £40 million. That might have been a bit overpriced at the time, but he was playing in the Champions League. He was highly rated across Europe, and we've seen why, as I explained in that video. But and I love him, but there's always been this point that Newcastle needed to maybe be ruthless about about selling a player or making a crucial decision. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing that Joe Linton's here, but there's an argument to say if you're going to go and progress the team and you have PSR issues and you need to change the way that the team plays, maybe Joe Linton was ultimately long term the player that you could have sold when his contract was running down. You could have still got your money back for him, and it would have been, a player who's 28. I said this at the time. There is an argument for that, and I think the fact that he's 28 means that sort of medium to long term, you've got to think about what happens next. But the good thing is, by the time he's 30, 31, you would imagine Louis Miley, if his progression goes as you expect it to, would be ready to step up and take his place. So potentially, again, it's so difficult to talk about Joe Linton because the great thing, it's what he brings is, as I said in my video the other day, not many players have been more definitive for this style of play and the way that this team's performed and the way that this team has worked in these last few years than Joe Linton. He defines this team because of his aggression. The the niggliness of what Eddie Howe's team was 2 years ago all came from him. The power that they had all came from him. But if they had this idea to change the system, then and they also knew deep down that they had to sell somebody, because they will have to sell somebody. I know Anthony Gordon signing a new contract and Isak signing a new contract, but there's coming a point where, because PSR is such that they're going to have to make a big sale, because every club who's doing that has done that. Like, look at Villa. As good as as well as they're doing, they've sold Grealish before, Diaby and Douglas Luiz. We will get back into the Wimbledon game in a second. I'm just going on a bit of a tangent because I do kind of make this. I think that this is a really key point. So Newcastle have had to be clever. Will have to be clever and identify who they want to sell. And at some point, unless something major happens, like the rule change, or they manage to get somewhere with some other sort of money, like they did obviously last year with Minte and Anderson. But ultimately, they need to. If they need to sell somebody, then Joe Linton might have been the ideal player before his contract, because it would have signified, you would have got this a player out of the team. Again, I really don't want to sound like I'm saying that Newcastle needed to sell Joe Linton, because they didn't, and should have sold Joe Linton, because they absolutely. It's great that he's still at the club, but this is the sort of problem that they have going forward, is that they evidently want and need players to break teams down, and Joe Linton just isn't that. Dexter says Joe Linton I love Joelinton, but he's like an odd jigsaw piece. He plays his best football down the left with Willock. That's the thing. I think for me that's my biggest issue with this whole thing. For me, I think that there is becoming a point, like Newcastle are consciously making a decision to move away, so to a way that doesn't suit Joelinton. So that's all I'm saying about this idea that, in the world where they know that they had to sell somebody, it would have made sense if they'd just been really ruthless. Obviously, we would have all hated it at the time, and I'd still hate it now because I think he's brilliant and all that all that's still true. But it they're left with a key player who's on a big contract, who there's still this sort of question over, and he's 28, and as sort of was alluded to, maybe he is. Once he goes, Miley comes in and the team progresses a bit better. But yeah, it feels a little bit like. James says, only just checking in, but a new contract for Longstaff is essential, arguably, just so we have options to sell him. This is the thing as well. Like, it's amazing how we're not even touching on the Wimbledon game because, and in fairness, there isn't much to really say beyond the fact that they got through. But yeah, James, it's a good point by James saying only just checked in, but the contract for Longstaff is essential. And lots of people are getting annoyed by this idea that Longstaff shouldn't have a new contract. And I had this argument about Almiron in the same sort of principled argument about how like when Charlotte FC were bidding like 8 million for Almiron. It does no good to Newcastle to sell Almiron for 8 million, just as it does no good to let Longstaff leave for free, because he's a real profit. Like, give him a new contract. He still has a place in the squad. I think that's evidenced by the fact that there aren't that many. We're talking about players who can get around the pitch and keep the ball ticking over. That's effectively what he does. So stylistically, he suits the squad where the squad's going. Obviously, he's not at the level you would imagine, but he's pure profit. And as James has rightly pointed out, you would absolutely keep him or give him a new contract, even if it is purely to give you a better control of what happens next with him. If he goes for free, then that's such a wasted opportunity. And it's the same with Almiron. Like, I get that lots of people are frustrated with Miguel Almiron and don't think he's good enough, and I get that people think the same about Longstaff, but just discarding them when there's no benefit to Newcastle makes no sense. So I fully support what James has just said. Fully support that. Johnny says, is Anderson a better fit than Joe for home games against low blocks? Possibly, but also, I think, again, I want to give Joelinton his props. Like, Newcastle probably don't get the result they do if Joe. Certainly, I'm actually certain that they probably don't get the result on. They don't get the result on Saturday without Joelinton in the team. So he still has a place. It's just this sort of like juxtaposition that's sort of turned up, and they would have been a worse team. And ultimately, like, the difficult thing about Newcastle with PSR is, and the difficult thing, like, whatever they do, and this is the harsh reality of why they did what they did in the summer, that whatever they do is going to be negative because there has to be some pain somewhere. And the pain was because the annoying thing is like obviously losing Anderson and Minter and not bringing in a player. The squad, in my opinion, the squad in my opinion is worse now than it was last season, probably overall, because you've not gained enough quality in the first team picture and you've lost two players. Like if the squad was the same squad, but as it was last year, but Minter was in there, it would be a stronger squad than it is now, because you would have the right wing thing sorted. He would be that unpredictable player. There's all of this sort of stuff that's in this situation, and I think that, yeah, I sort of think that whatever the answer to this is, like, because Newcastle are in this situation, they have to make these decisions where there's a negative. And in terms of right now, I understand why they cashed in on Anderson, who, as I think, as Dex has probably pointed out, he wasn't a key player in Howe's plans. That's why they were talking to Wolves about selling him before they sold him to Forest. And Minter, who obviously wasn't part of the first team picture last year, so it was a lack of a gain rather than a major loss in that sense. That was the. I understand why the club did that, because it was the easiest, most painless way of. Whereas obviously, if they sold Gordon as they tried, if they maybe sold Joe Linton, if they had a little bit more forethought, that would have been a major painful thing, and there would have been loads of people criticizing that. So they're in a no-win situation ultimately. But the point I'm trying to make is that ultimately they're trying to progress to this team that can break teams down, but the squad the squad makeup just isn't right. And I would go back to trying to do what they did 2 years ago, because they still have and this is what I kind of expected them to do. I know obviously against Wimbledon, it's obviously mitigating circumstances because Wimbledon are a League Two side, so they should be coming at St James's Park. Newcastle should be dominating the ball in that scenario, but they should be trying to do more of what they did on Saturday, and more of what they did 2 years ago, because it still suits the squad as in the same way. But yeah, I think there's such a disparity in the squad because of that. Let's talk a little bit about let's get back on the topic of the Wimbledon game. What were people's thoughts on the big story? Was the fact that Will Asuda started, and I think that wasn't a surprise. If he didn't start in this game, when was he? It was kind of like when will he start, sort of thing. So the fact that he started is the fact that he started is it's not a surprise. But I wanted to throw it to the guys in the chat, to you guys, and say what did you make of his performance, and does it give you hope for Premier League games going forward that he could come in and help? Dex has also just said on the last point, fans are looking for reasons and people to blame, but as Mitchell said, it's not fit for purpose. How needs the squad refreshed? And I think this is a key point. Like, I think I've voiced sort of concerns about Paul Mitchell in these videos, and the fit for purpose thing, I think, was not taken into full consideration into what he meant. Like, I think Newcastle, again, they've made a difficult decision. It's very difficult to criticize Newcastle for doing what they've done, because what they've done has got themselves into the position, buying Isak and buying Gordon and buying Bruno, who are players all three of them who were players who were above their financial and probably even footballing status at the time. That's what you need to do to close the gap on the pitch, but it's also hastened this closing of this PSR gap off it. And they could have chosen to do what other teams have done, or they could have chosen to just continuously follow what they could have done and not taken any PSR risks, and they would have ultimately they wouldn't have gotten the Champions League. They would be a lot further away from where they are now. And this is the thing. This is the difficult thing. It's really impossible to sort of criticize Newcastle for what they've done, because what they've done is got themselves into this great position where we're having the conversation that they should be in the top four. But it's also a double-edged. It's also had a negative impact, because it's put them in this sort of like position where they have these horrible crossroads where they kind of go, okay, so we need to sell somebody. And it's ended up being Minter, but they're going to have to. The situation isn't. It might be a little bit better now that they've not spent 70 million in the summer, but they still need. So they're still in this position where they still need to replace players and change the squad up and refresh the squad to change the system. But they can't do that without then having some more painful decisions. So it's a really difficult situation, the whole PSR thing. And I do think that Paul Mitchell's comment about not being fit for purpose maybe wasn't the criticism of how the people thought it was. Perhaps, I don't know. James says Asula is in the Prem would still represent a bit of a wild card. It just isn't how it's started. I think that's a really fair point. He wants to know exactly what his players are going to give him, and Yeah, that is a very that's like I can't argue with that. I think that is the case. That is why, um, and in that sense, that's what Asula is. Asula is the sort of progression to the a way around PSR effectively. That in and I think Newcastle are hoping that their way around PSR in the long term is that people if Joe Linton goes, Miley is his replacement, who isn't a major signing. Asula is a key player in the future who didn't cost a load of money. Lewis Hall comes in and becomes a really key player, so that was the sort of bracket that Minter was in as well. So, but the issue is that's at odds with what Newcastle need at the moment, and that's why ultimately they didn't sign. We were saying in the summer, weren't we, how many centre backs, and it's the point I'm trying to make is every issue you're still seeing now. Like that's a really good point that's a specific point about Asula that James has just made, but it also represents a really sort of like fundamental battle that Newcastle face for the identity of the squad within PSR. Like Eddie Howe wants to know what his players will give him, but he which means that he needs to generally he wants a player who's probably played in the Premier League and is experienced in the Premier League. That's why they went for Gahey so much. This is just a bigger picture of what James has just said effectively, but that in turn means that there's less value because he's played in the Premier League, so his value is more expensive, which is an issue with PSR. So there needs to be risks taken with I don't think that's conducive for where Newcastle are going to go. I think Eddie Howe needs to be a bit more risky in that sense, but I think stylistically, I think this is my point about Asula specifically. I think stylistically that it gives a continuation that in the Premier League with Asula playing up front when Isak isn't, because he can still run the channels. He's still tall. He can still get in behind. He can still do certain things that Isak can do, not to the same level. And obviously, there's lots of stuff Isak can do that Asula just can't. But there's a sense that the team is sort of playing in the same style as a focal point. That was my point in the pre-Fulham game pre-Fulham video when I made the point that I think Asula should be the starting striker when Isak isn't there. It was fine against City. It was fine because Newcastle were pressing high and they were in transitions and it suited Gordon. But when they go to Everton, they're going to have the ball again. It's going to be the same issue. And I think playing up to Asula and using his, and there were lots of these little flashes from last night that cheers James, thank you. I really enjoyed your contribution. Do come back next time. But yeah, there needs to. I thought there were flashes of what Asula brings yesterday in terms of his physicality. There was a lovely little turn in the second half. He missed the target. It was a slightly tight angle. That's something that Gordon doesn't bring you, and that ability to create something out of nothing. That's what he brings, and that's what Isak brings to a much higher standard. And that's my ultimately, And there's Dexter said Solanke took 4 years to become a top striker. Solanke was very similar to what I see in Asula when he was at Liverpool, and when he went to Bournemouth, he was very much this. He was probably slightly ahead, obviously, but he cost 19 million, and he didn't look like a player that was gonna score loads of goals. It took him till he was 26 as to become this player that Spurs thought he was worth paying for. So yeah, I think that there's got to be patience with Asula, but I saw enough stylistically to say that they've made the right decision. But again, there needs to be a risk taken in a league game and this is both generally about Asula, but also within whenever Howe's building his squad, there needs to be more risks taken because it just isn't conducive to to have a player that Newcastle don't have a squad full of players that you know what they're going to get. You know, they don't have 25 Bruno Isaks and Gordon's level players. If they did, that'd be perfect for Eddie Howe because he'd know what he was going to get out of everyone. But ultimately, when Isak isn't there, and the choice is Gordon down the middle against the low block, or Asula down the middle against the low block, I think there was enough to suggest last night why Asula, even though he's not maybe at the level yet, stylistically would be a better option. But there's too many imbalance. This is, I think, fundamentally the issue for me. There's too many imbalances. If you haven't, by the way, if you're in the stream and you haven't liked the stream, please do like it. Also, as I say, subscribe to the channel. I didn't expect there's more people in the chat than I was expecting at this time of the morning. I was only going to come on and do a quick reaction because there's no time to do a big analysis video. And it was going to be on Asula, and it was going to be the point that I've just made effectively. So it's not a big deal, really. But yeah, please continue to like the stream, put some things in the chat. Let's keep it going for another half an hour. And I said at the start of the stream that either tonight or possibly tonight, but possibly tomorrow, depending on my schedule, I'll make an announcement on Twitter and put it out there and stuff. But I'll be doing a live on the stadium and what you think Newcastle should do with the stadium in terms of staying or going. So that'll be either tonight or tomorrow. Please do join me for that. I'm hoping for a bit more of a lively debate because it'll be at about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock either UK time tonight or tomorrow to talk about the stadium, because I think it's getting to that stage now where if there's lots of people saying one thing and lots of people saying the opposite, and I think there needs to be a bit of a debate. Just I'm really interested. I have some thoughts myself, and I'm just really interested to hear what you guys thought as well. So I think as well. So later on, we'll be talking a little bit more about the stadium. Ryan says it almost feels like how we forced into taking these risks, given Mitchell's history and specialism in youth development and finding gems across Europe. This is what This is again. I completely agree with what Ryan just said, and the thing is, it comes back to a conflict and a difference and a point of and a crossroads and an imbalance, and the thing that it isn't on the right. And this is the thing that I had, the worry that I had, like from the moment that if you watch back to my my videos from the moment that Staveley left. And the sort of uncertainty that brought, and then the moment that Paul Mitchell came in, and the uncertainty that brought, with specifically with Howe, because he wasn't a big fan of Dan Ashworth, and Dan Ashworth wasn't somebody who was in there to focus on recruitment. He was a much bigger picture guy, whereas Paul Mitchell is in to talk about it, is in for 90% recruitment as Darren Eales. Darren Eales now leaving, which is obviously very, very sad and not foreseen and not part of the plan. But once Darren Eales is replaced, then that's another factor in terms of what does the replacement want for the future as well. What's their say on how it'll go? But there's always been this idea of conflict of interests. What does Howe want for the team, and Howe wants experience and guarantees and a way of and to know what he's going to get from his team. Whereas the PSR situation, which is a big reason why I think that Paul Mitchell was brought in, the PSR situation requires Newcastle to take risks on players. So ultimately, that's they're at loggerheads, and even if they're that's fundamentally why there's this constant talk of what's going on behind the scenes, because there's constantly these conflicts of interest. Like even on the pitch, as we've said, like they want to progress the ball, they want to be good in possession, and yet their squad and their team is better suited to intensity and transitions. That's what we've seen. So, and off the pitch, they want to be, one wants to be wants experience and guarantees. The other one has been brought in to have a longer term view. That's a conflict. So this is what I said off there. I think it was post Fulham or or there was a video where I talked about the lack of direction and the constant feeling of conflict. And I think this is where it comes down to. So Ryan's absolutely right. Eddie Howe will be forced to change something, or there's a big something's got to have to give there in that sense. Scott, how Sai says it seems that Howe's scared to take the leap of faith in signing young European talent. I think the biggest problem I have with this whole thing is doesn't even have to be about young European talent. It doesn't have to be a bunch of Minters or Pivasses or whoever else, these young lads that they've brought in who are just clearly for like 5-10 years time. The best that Newcastle have done in the transfer market have been, and I hate this idea, generally speaking, he's not Premier League proven. He's not Premier League proven. Whatever. Like, I hate that whole principle, because the best signings that Newcastle have made so far have been Botman, Bruno, and Isak, in my opinion. In terms of playing. Obviously, Botman had his injury issues last year, which affected his performances, but consistency and quality. Those three players have come in not from big teams, and not even from, like, two of them came from France. And it goes back. I remember Graham Carr saying to me, I had a conversation. I spoke to Graham Carr a couple of times after he left, under Mike Ashley. The biggest thing that Graham Carr had in terms of finding players wasn't there wasn't enough quality on the pitch. It was that the team that he was working with at Newcastle didn't back him enough to get the key players. He told me the story of how he took Mike Ashley to watch Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang play for St Etienne, and he didn't want to sign him. He had to beg him to sign Wijnaldum, and Wijnaldum was £15 million. And I think we can all agree, even though he got relegated in that team, he was Newcastle's best player that season. And then he went on to Liverpool to be a phenomenal player. So there's so much quality in Europe that Newcastle there's so much evidence of Newcastle succeeding in signing players from Europe, and that's what annoyed me this summer, was that there was apparently £70 million to spend, and Newcastle have signed two players in that bracket, in Botman and Bruno, who from Europe. They could have done the same thing again. If they'd signed two players from France or Italy or Spain for £35 million, you could have definitely found two players who could have improved the squad. And that's my biggest issue, is that this idea that, because you're right, Eddie Howe is worried about it, about taking risks, but it's not even about the sort of young European talent and sort of the emerging thing. Like, the evidence is there pre Newcastle's takeover. Obviously, they made a big thing about when Graham Carr was there. Cabaye, Tiote, Cisse, Wijnaldum. Mitrovic was a bit of a loose cannon, but they made a profit on him. And then since the takeover, Botman, Bruno, Isak. There's so much evidence of quality players in Europe who you don't have to break the bank for, and that's what I did this whole video on options Newcastle had at centre half, and all of them came. They're all under. There's Sky Sports reported that Edmund Tapsoba went to Bayer Leverkusen. From Bayer Leverkusen would have been cheaper than Mark Gahey. Edmund Tapsoba plays in the Champions League for the Bundesliga winners, and he would have been cheaper than Mark Gahey. If you don't just focus on the specifics of that, focus on the principle. If a player who's playing in the Champions League for the Bundesliga winners is cheaper than the player you want, maybe you've got the wrong approach. And that's my biggest problem with this whole thing. Dex has made a fair point about the players that were scouted by Steve Nixon. I think that Ryan, sorry, I'm just reading because I went on this big rant without even looking at the chat, so it's moved on a little bit. Size made a good point about waiting for Brentford or Brighton to sign a rough diamond and pay triple. But I think there's a key point about generally, specifically Brighton. They've sort of mastered this, And Brighton have done have got a better version of what Newcastle ultimately tried to do, said that they were trying to do under Mike Ashley, which was to bring in cheaper players, sell them for profit, keep doing that. And that's a great model if you're Brighton and you're a small club punching above your weight. But Newcastle want to be a top side, and they have to take risks in certain ways as well. But it's not about like finding rough. It's not even about finding rough diamonds. I can list, like, to me, for example, Diamonde at Sporting Lisbon, Victor Gyökeres. Newcastle don't need a striker, but Victor Gyökeres now is a prime example, right, of a player. And this is, I'm really enjoying this conversation. The fact that it's gone away. We'll wrap up and come back to the Wimbledon thing. But I do think the whole point, the strand of this that's got us here, by the way, if you're just joining or you're not following, is basically a lot of you guys have put things in the chat about specific issues that have related to the Wimbledon game that are actually more linked into bigger, deeper conflicts within Newcastle. And this is how this has worked. Like, the team on the pitch is trying to do something different, and off the pitch is trying to do something completely different to what they need to do. Like Victor Gyökeres at Sporting Lisbon is possibly the most sought after striker in the world at the moment. He's in ridiculous form. People wouldn't bat an eyelid at spending 100 million euros on him now, and yet he was probably worth the risk when he was at Coventry, when Sporting paid 24 million euros, and he was certainly worth the risk at 50 million euros last season. Like, this progression has just been like, I don't think, and that's kind of the point. You have to wait for somebody to be worth. You have to wait for somebody to if you wait for someone to prove how good they are and to have this guarantee, then their value is going to be far bigger than what you want. Like, think of it from Newcastle's perspective. Like, loads of teams were really annoyed. There was lots of talk that people at Liverpool and Arsenal and Manchester City were left dumbfounded by the fact that Bruno Guimaraes came into the Premier League and hit the ground running last season. 3 seasons ago now. In that first 6 months, how did we miss him? How didn't we get him? That was what lots of people have said. People have said to me, but also it's kind of well known within journalistic circles. I think I mentioned it on Sky Sports that people at the top of those clubs were really annoyed, but they didn't take the risk because they thought, oh, he only plays for Lyon and he's not proven himself yet. But now the point is that they've now figured out that they have to pay Newcastle 100 million euros, 100 million pounds to get him out of the club. So it's now the risk is whether he's worth that. And it's the same principle and so Newcastle should think about that when with their transfer strategy, because if they're trying to buy players for, who could become 100 million pound players, buy them when they're worth 30, 40, not because if they're worth 100 million, as we've seen with Mark Gahey is probably worth 40, and yet Palace are putting a valuation of 70. Alexander Isak in this current market is probably in terms of what he's worth to it within the market is probably around 100 million euros. To Newcastle, he's worth 150. So the club value and club market value are two different things. And if you are Eddie Howe and you try to only buy players who are only going to guarantee things and are going to come into this team and you're sure they're going to make a difference, and your criteria is that they've already played in the Premier League, then they're only going to be players that the club values at higher than their initial value. Need to bring back Mark Ashley, who's always up for a risk. I wouldn't go that far. Recent hold the air talks between Mitchell and Howe sound promising, though. Howe has apparently agreed on proposed changes to strategy which made by Mitchell. I guess we'll see. Yeah, precisely. I think my biggest issue is with, and it's always been the issue between Howe and my biggest issue between Howe and Mitchell is that it's never been about specific agreements and whether somebody agrees. It's about a principle thing. Like, Mitchell fundamentally represents something that Howe doesn't fundamentally agree with. Howe, as we've just said, he wants certainty. He has a very regimented way of working. His his staff is the same staff that he's had since he was at Bournemouth. 6 people follow him. He has his inner circle, he has his way of working. He wants to be in control of things. Mitchell is about finding things and taking risks and doing things. That's fundamentally complete different sides of a complete conflict. So whether they agree and try and find a way forward, they're not going to be on the same page. That's my biggest worry. And it's great that this has turned into a transfer live. But I think that this is kind of the point when you dig deep into Newcastle. This is all linked to the Wimbledon game in a sense, because if you dig deep into what Newcastle's issues are, it comes down to conflict, and that's my biggest problem at Newcastle. That's my biggest problem, is that it all feels like 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 there's some sort of sense of like of it's not they're not on the same page on and off the pitch, and that isn't a recipe for success going forward. As I say, like it was made the point earlier, like they it was a really good point that someone made about Steve Nixon, and apologies, I haven't really been keeping up with the chat so much this time, but it was a really good point that those players who joined in the first couple of transfer windows, Isak, Botman, Bruno, were already known to Newcastle via Steve Nixon, and they came in and they sat around the table. They really, really wanted Botman from that first meeting. His name was that's why they chased him throughout January, if you remember. And I can't imagine that there's no really key players who out in Europe, and even throw Joelinton in there now. Like if you look at the key players of this squad, the spine of the team. Okay, Pope and Gordon are Premier League based, but Botman, Joelinton, Bruno, Tonali going forward, Isak are all European based players, and it just goes to show that there needs to be a bit of a connection in terms of what they do recruitment wise, but then all that also comes into what they do in terms of the squad, in terms of the style of play that they play. And yesterday is a mitigating circumstance. I understand that there isn't much to say about the game yesterday. It was a very boring game. I wasn't at it. I was working for the BBC EFL output, so I was unable to. I watched it in the background, but I wasn't able to focus on it, and I couldn't react to it live as well. That's why we're sat here now rather than last night. But yeah, it just feels like that game was always going to be like that, because Wimbledon were going to do. And by the way, I'll give a shout out to Wimbledon for the fact that they also did really well in holding Newcastle and keeping Newcastle at bay. And yeah, I think what I'm going to probably do is I'm going to probably make a video out of that conversation that we had about conflict and re-release that, because I think that rather than refilming myself talking, I think it's a really good. I think that's a point that hasn't really been made, is this sort of level of inner conflict that is impacting Newcastle. But yeah, I'm rambling. Wimbledon did really well to come to St James's Park and make life difficult. It was a nervy occasion, and also credit to them to keep them there. Obviously all the issues with Plough Lane, and obviously they're a fan owned club. It's a brilliant story, and the fact that they came up and there was such goodwill between the teams, it was nice to see. But Newcastle ultimately got the job done. Before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about Chelsea and the next round. What do you Size asked, any news on the Dubravka injury? So I think I read that Eddie Howe said that he didn't seem that Eddie Howe wasn't too concerned about it. I think he should be fine. Pope obviously missed the game, which a lot of people probably just assumed wouldn't be a thing. But Pope missed the game through an injury, slight injury, and he's slight doubt for Everton. But we'll talk a bit about Everton later in the week. and yeah, and so I think he should be fine. But I think it's Everton. If you remember last year, Everton was the first game for Dubravka, and it didn't go too well. So I think it's more important that Pope's fit for that game. Um, yeah, let's talk a bit about Chelsea. I mean, do you have how they're going really well? I mean, in the next round, are you confident of going through? Ultimately, it's horses for courses. Newcastle did enough, but they'll need much more. They'll need a stronger team. And the worrying thing for me is you still need uh, Bruno and Gordon and Isak when he's fit to function for Newcastle to hit their highest levels. And yeah, I think. But what do you think about Chelsea? That Chelsea game? Chelsea are poor defensively. We'll get hammered if we go back to our poor form. Yeah, they're in a really good place. Chelsea. I've been fairly surprised by how well they've done. Cole Palmer is, as Si's pointed out, it's crucial how they deal with him. So the last time Chelsea came to St James's Park was November last year, which was sort of pre. Palmer was doing okay, but he wasn't like. I think he really kicked on in the second half of the season, so he wasn't seen as this major threat. Now he's like probably Jamie Carragher was saying he's the best player in the league at the moment. Yeah, it feels like we need to defend. Dexter says we need to defend like we did against City to combat Palmer. I think we need to play like we did against City because I think Chelsea will come and do the same things. They're similar sort of things. But Newcastle can hurt them in transition, and that's Newcastle's best opportunity. They're not going to be able to. The good thing is that they probably won't dominate the ball as much, which will give them. It's the same sort of principle as against City. They can turn the game over a bit more. Conceded 7 goals in 6 games, but as much more of a threat and attack. We need to be disruptive. It suits maybe it suits Newcastle then. Maybe that whole thing of Joe Linton being disruptive and Willock in transitions, stretching the pitch. Tonali playing the ball forward and all that sort of all the stuff we've talked about and all the stuff that worked against City at the weekend might work against Chelsea in the cup. And Isak will hopefully be back by then as well. Obviously, it's the end of October, so he should be. It's the international break, was what Eddie Howe said, didn't he? About the about that, yeah. So yeah. Any more thoughts on the game? Think about wrapping up. There's only a few guys left in the chat. I thank you so much for turning out. I didn't know what doing a match review at 10 o'clock in the morning on a weekday is always a risk because you don't know who's going to show up. But you guys have kept the conversation going, so I'm really pleased that you've been here to keep the conversation going. It was Dex's point the other day in the chat, wasn't it, about preview getting somebody an Everton, or will it be an Everton perspective this week, or the opposition perspective on a chat on the preview videos, which I'm going to look at doing for Everton. So thanks so much for that, Dexter. Really appreciate that from the other day. It's a really good point, especially the keeping it journalistic and so I'm gonna look at that for Thursday. But yeah, if I did a St James's Park stay or go live, possibly tonight at 7 or 8 o'clock, would you guys be up for that, or possibly tomorrow? But yeah, let me know if you'd be up for that as well. And yeah, we'll be back. Newcastle have Chelsea in the next round. Si says I put Joe Linton on Palmer to scare him, but nothing seems to affect him. He's cold as ice. He is. Lots of people. So I want to say I feel like Cole Palmer gets a lot of stick for being what he is, which is like he clearly doesn't, like, as you say, he doesn't affect him, and lots of people say that he's not very bright and all this sort of thing, and these memes of like that. You know, when he says "what" on that screen, that keeps coming. Oh, you're on Australian time. Okay, so that doesn't. Okay, so maybe if you watch it back on, so I guess that's why it suits for you for morning ones again, then Dexter. Okay, so I'll keep that in mind. But I think I'll do the other one will be on later. So maybe if you watch it back, if you can't join me, but fully understand. But yeah, the Cole Palmer thing. Lots of people like think that he's that he's not very bright or he's all this and whatever. But I think that helps him. I think that's he just seems to just get on with his life and just play football in a way like. And actually, if you watch like what City fans have said in the past, like in the last few weeks, like they always saw this, maybe not this soon and this level, but they always saw this progression in him. Like the guy is legitimately really good. Like I remember this time last year, there was also talk of would it be Palmer or would it be Gordon? And as much as good as Gordon is in the England squad, as good as Gordon is, Palmer's now on a sort of like, is it Foden or is it Palmer level? And that's quite, it's credit to him. So I think he will be a massive threat. But Joe Linton can threaten anybody, can't he? I think. People seem to be dropping out of the chat, so I think I'm going to wrap that up. But yeah, I will be back at some point in the next either tonight or tomorrow to do a live on Newcastle Stadium situation. I think it's worth having that conversation. Should Newcastle stay or go from St James's Park? So join me for that either tonight or tomorrow. It'll be signposted. It'll be signposted within enough time. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time. Please like, share, and subscribe, and keep joining the community. I really enjoy these lives. I really enjoy the banter it all gives me. That's a really good point from Dexter. Gaza wasn't particularly bright, but what a player he was. And if Palmer turns anything out like him, then yeah, definitely. Cheers, guys. I'll see you next time. Like, share, and subscribe. And as I say, cheers.